we are standing in front of the Abraham Lincoln parking deck. Okay. You know, it's not a bad idea to name a parking deck after Lincoln. You know, all in all, there's a reason for it. And not only is essentially on that site at the corner here was a building called the Majors Building. On the top floor of that three-story building was a hall called Majors Hall. And in May 29th of 1856, a large convention took place there. The convention was organized by people who started buying into this idea that Owen Lovejoy had been promoting about how to stop slavery through constitutional means. And what really set that off, you're going to get it kind of in the weeds history lesson here, was a bill that Stephen Douglas, the Illinois senator, succeeded in passing and signed by President Buchanan, no, not by Buchanan, by Pierce, and it was called the Nebraska Act. And in that act, it stated that a state could vote whether it wanted to be slave or free. Now, previous to that act, there was a mutually agreed upon political principle, which was south of a certain line in the United States would be slave, and north of that line would be free. And that was called the Missouri Compromise. And once that act passed, that broke the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise kept peace between North and South, peace of a type. With that broken, it became a question of great, actually economic and existential concern of people of the North. Because the South had been pretty successful in controlling the presidency. You've got to remember that they got extra votes for their slaves, 3/5 of a person. And so they were a political powerhouse. And getting more states into that system could mean the expansion of slavery throughout the North. Now, there's a reason why the South wanted to see slavery expanding. There's a good reason. Can anybody tell me what the number one crop of the state of Virginia was in 1855? Slaves, exactly. Slaves, human beings. That was their number one crop. That was the number one cash piece that they had. They were breeding slaves and selling them. Now, how did they do that? Well, raping black women was part of it. It's part of the deal. But there was money to be made from these human beings, thousands of dollars. Farmers, plantation owners would mortgage their slaves in order to buy other slaves. So they're financially leveraging. Now, a system like that, if you stop the expansion of slavery, you break the back of the slave market. And if you break the back of the slave market, these mortgaged plantations are going to go belly up because the cash doesn't work, because they're in hock. It's a very vicious economic cycle that people were in, and the South was very aware of this. They saw that this notion that Lovejoy was talking and some Whigs who were becoming friendly to this were talking about was threatening to their very economic way of life. Half of the value of all property in the South is human beings. So if you cut that off, you're talking about destroying fortunes across the area. So we're talking about some real serious kinds of things that are being talked about. The Northern viewpoint, led by Lovejoy, is that this is an immoral practice. It's destructive to humanity, it's destructive to common humanity, it's destructive to your moral code, your ability to lead a decent life. Was one of their arguments, a pretty good one. Another one was, and this is something that we have to think about, can the farmer who is farming 80 acres economically compete in a market where his neighbor can have 4,000 acres that's worked by slaves? No. The freehold farmer, the independent farmer, farming for himself on his 80 acres, was going to go belly up. And so the notion of democracy as a place where people are free and independent because they own land, they work that land sustains them and their family, is broken. So that becomes a very important piece for these thousands, tens of thousands of farmers who are farming 80 acres or 40 acres or 160 acres. They're small and they want to survive, they want to make it. With those ideas in mind, we see a group of people gather in May of 1856, the AntiNebraska Convention. They called it that because they were against this Nebraska Act. And it went for about 2 days. And they finished it off with a keynote type of speech. They finished it off with a keynote kind of speech by Lincoln. And that's been called the lost speech. And there's been a lot of mythology about it. The basic situation with the speech is that Lincoln said some things that undoubtedly become what is the initiation of the Civil War. Because what he says is that we say to our Southern brethren that slavery shall not expand in this Union. And you say to us that if you try to pass that, we will leave the Union. And we say to our Southern brethren, you shan't. You will not leave the Union. We will not allow that to happen. Now that's what Lincoln said here in 1856. He knew what the national implications were of this movement. He knew what was coming down. And it was said that it was so eloquent that it galvanized that party, that new movement behind that idea, that Lincoln and those political operatives like Jesse Fell were able to bring some new people into that group. Because while this was going on, we had some other things happening in town. There was a Know-Nothing convention. That was the American Party, who was anti-immigrant. And at the same time, they had people coming in. Actually, some of the principal speakers at this convention were German immigrants. So they were able to, but they had the German immigrants and these anti-immigrant Know-Nothings had something in common. They were both against slavery. So they said, look, let's set our differences aside on this, and let's just focus on this. There was a deep politics of violence in the air because 6 weeks previous to the convention, Lawrence, Kansas had been sacked by pro-slavery mobs or pro-slavery militia that overthrow a governor, Governor Reeder, who they imprisoned. He escapes dressed as either a wood chopper or as an Irish laborer. There's two different versions. I guess they probably dressed alike. And so he finds his way to Bloomington. He's here at this convention. He's talking on the streets about what's going on in Kansas. Now Reeder is here because another guy in town by the name of William Arney. And Arney is the national secretary of the Kansas Immigration Aid Society. And what the Kansas Immigration Aid Society is a group that is actively getting anti-slave farmers to move to Kansas and helping them out with money and arming them as well. A Bloomington party is organized in 1856. They call it the Bloomington Party. And they report back they're going into Kansas through Iowa. You can't go in through Missouri because the militia there will stop you. You go in through Iowa. And they report we're on the border of Kansas, we're well armed and we're prepared. So that's the politics that's going on at this point in time, literally in May of 1856. The New York Herald Tribune was here for this. All the St. Louis papers were here for this. All the Chicago papers were here for this. The Cincinnati papers, the Alton papers. The eyes of America were on this town at that point in time. And what comes out of that, as we well know, is Lincoln becomes a national leader. He loses an election, but he gains an audience to advance this notion that we do not allow slavery to expand, which has a constitutional basis, and that's how we're going to defeat it. And we know, of course, the rest of the story. Now, what we're going to do is talk. Any questions on this?
What happened to the building?
What happened to the Majors Hall? Okay. In 1872, the third story of Majors Hall burned off. And so it was gone. The hall where it took place was gone. The building stood there until 1957, when in a effort to address the automobile-centric nature of commerce, the McLean County Association of Commerce, with city cooperation and help, acquired that square block to turn into a surface parking lot. And that was one of the remnants of that building was there. So we lost the building in 72, and then the rest of the block went in 1957. There were some people encouraging that restoration take place and whatnot, but there was not, at that point in our community history, an interest in the physical preservation of historic buildings. On the other hand, that same year, the David Davis family gave the Davis Mansion to the state of Illinois, so maybe some good came out of it. We're going to go down the street.